In 1546, Enescu's shoulder blade ripped from its socket with a slick, grinding crack that echoed through the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. But that wasn't the worst part. What her tormentors did next was so meticulously designed to annihilate the female body that modern forensic scientists have refused to reconstruct it. You're about to uncover the most gender-targeted torture device ever built, a mechanism engineered to weaponize the female form in ways that will make your stomach twist. I'm going to expose 3 terrifying truths that history books tried to erase. First, how Tudor engineers altered the rack to assault women's reproductive organs and exploit skeletal differences. Second, why did one woman's screams echo so sharply across the Thames that crowds formed on London Bridge horrified? And third, the sickening reason some executioners argued this device was too gentle and demanded something crueler. Here's what they never taught you in school. This wasn't just about forcing confessions. The rack became the ultimate weapon of patriarchal control, a tool meant to shatter women so completely that others would fear ever defying a man again. Before we enter the darkest chapter of gender-specific torture, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to hear will change how you understand systemic oppression. Stay until the end, because the woman who finally turned this machine against its creators will restore your faith in resilience. Let's travel back to Tudor England, a world where being born female was enough to make you pray. It's the year 1534. Henry VIII has crowned himself supreme head of the Church of England. What follows isn't only religious persecution, it's a campaign of terror aimed at silencing women who dared to think, speak, or believe for themselves. And here's the part your history classes conveniently skipped. This suppression was not gender-blind. Women endured methods of torment specifically crafted to attack their bodies, minds, and social roles in ways men never faced. Imagine living in a world where your husband could beat you by law, your father could sell you into marriage, and the crown could torture you using devices modeled around the anatomy that made you female. The message couldn't have been clearer. Your body belonged to men, and they'd destroy it if you forgot your place. The Tower's torture rooms became laboratories of gendered cruelty, records sealed for centuries and only recently studied by forensic historians reveal a level of calculated hatred that defies imagination. Picture yourself as a Tudor woman. Maybe you were caught reading a forbidden text, or questioned the church, or perhaps a neighbor's jealousy marked you for arrest. Within hours, you're dragged through London's narrow streets to a stone fortress where men have spent years of inventing ways to erase everything that defines you as a woman. But here's why this matters now. The same psychological patterns that justified gender-based torture then still exist in modern conflict zones today. Understanding how entire cultures normalize targeted violence as necessary control exposes patterns we need to confront. The 3 cases I'll show you don't just recount history, they reveal how systems of power turn the human body into a battlefield. Let's begin with the blueprint that made torture a science. In 1540, Master Engineer Thomas Norton presented Henry VIII with drawings so vile they still turn experts pale. These weren't just mechanical designs, they were anatomical maps showing how women's bodies could be used against them for maximum psychological devastation. Here's the twisted brilliance of Norton's improvements. Traditional racks stretched victims evenly, dislocating joints in uniform tension. Norton's version introduced asymmetric stress protocols, a polished phrase for targeting women's wider hips and lower center of gravity. Adjustable iron clamps let torturers manipulate pressure points so that the female pelvic joints snapped in patterns that tore internal organs. Norton's notes, written in the calm tone of a physician, explained that the female frame presents vulnerabilities unseen in men, and he wasn't alone. He collaborated with court doctors who supplied anatomical sketches pinpointing the most fragile tissues. These weren't madmen, they were educated elites, applying medical science to perfect suffering. His most horrifying modification was what he named the birthing restraint. Women were bound in the same posture as childbirth, then stretched. The symbolism was deliberate, turned a woman's ability to give life into a stage for pain. Every onlooker was meant to remember that even motherhood could be weaponized. Forensic historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who analyzed Norton's diagrams in 2019, said they reveal a systemic logic of gendered torture unmatched until the 20th century's worst atrocities. Now, imagine yourself fastened to this machine. The ropes tighten at your wrists and ankles, but extra bindings force your body into angles that exploit every biological trait of being female. The men pulling the levers aren't just seeking confession, they're sending a message to every woman in England: obedience or annihilation. Ionescu lasted exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes on Norton's device. Records say her screams changed in tone, producing a chilling, inhuman wail that haunted London's night air. But her torment didn't end with pain. What came next was psychological destruction. On March 15, 1581, Richard Topcliffe, Elizabeth I's chief interrogator, opened his leather diary and wrote one of the most disturbing documents in English history. He described a two-stage system designed not just to break the body but to fracture the mind. Here's how Topcliffe's enhanced persuasion protocol worked. And pay attention, because every detail was crafted around female biology. First came the scavenger's daughter, a metal frame that folded the victim into a crushing fetal position. But here's the grotesque twist. Topcliffe timed this phase according to women's menstrual cycles. His journal shows he tracked female prisoners' monthly periods and scheduled torture to coincide with their most vulnerable hormonal days, when pain thresholds dropped and emotional control weakened. He weaponized nature itself. After hours of compression that left them barely conscious, the victims were moved immediately to Norton's rack. This transition wasn't random, it was designed to create what Topcliffe called corporeal confusion. The nervous system, already overwhelmed by crushing force, would short-circuit when stretched. The result? A total breakdown of body and mind. Women subjected to Topcliffe's method began to produce what he chillingly called unnatural vocal manifestations, cries so warped by pain they no longer sounded human. Yet the most disturbing entry in his private notes describes something he labeled the gratitude phase. After endless cycles of compression and stretching, some women began whispering words of thanks to their tormentors during brief pauses. Their broken minds, desperate to assign meaning to suffering, mistook the fleeting absence of agony for mercy. Margaret Ward, tortured in 1588 for sheltering fugitive Catholic priests, endured 17 full cycles over 2 brutal days. In his records, Topcliffe wrote that she began addressing him as Father, pleading for him to teach her rightly. This wasn't mere physical torment. It was psychological reprogramming, a deliberate attempt to erase a woman's self-worth and autonomy. I know this is dark, but if you're still watching, you're clearly as drawn to history's forbidden truths as I am. Don't forget to subscribe, because next week, I'll expose the medieval torture device that even the Spanish Inquisition deemed too horrific to use. Topcliffe's compression stretching cycle had a horrifying efficiency. It forced confessions from 73% of women, compared to barely 31% under conventional torture. He had engineered a near-perfect system for dismantling female resolve. Yet one woman's defiance would expose its ultimate flaw. John Fox stood in Smithfield Market, watching smoke rise from yet another pyre. But he wasn't just a witness, he was chronicling a revolution. His Book of Martyrs documented how female Protestant captives turned their suffering into the most potent weapon of all, truth. Here's what the Tudor authorities never foresaw, and it remains one of the greatest lessons in resistance that activists still study today. Women like Rose Allen and Joyce Lewis transformed their torture into a form of public defiance that humiliated their executioners. Rose Allen, stretched on the rack in 1557, did something no one had dared before. Instead of screaming, she began preaching. Her voice, echoing through the vaulted chamber, turned agony into testimony. Fox's eyewitness notes describe how her words carried beyond the tower walls, reaching crowds gathered outside. And this was the brilliance of their rebellion. They understood that every scream, every groan echoing through London, became living proof of royal cruelty. Every mutilated body paraded through the streets stood as undeniable evidence of the Crown's fear of women who could think for themselves. Joyce Lewis took it even further. During her torture, she began narrating each act in detail, transforming her pain into a running commentary. "Now they tighten the rope around my ankle," she declared. "Now they press my shoulders until the joint separates." Her words shattered the illusion of secrecy that torturers relied upon. Suddenly, the men behind those walls were not executioners. They were spectacles of their own barbarity. But the most astonishing act of defiance came from Ionescu herself. Before her death, she dictated a meticulous record of her torment, complete with names, dates, and mechanical specifics. This wasn't just a confession. It was evidence, a manifesto against tyranny that would echo across Europe for generations. Fox's accounts reveal something extraordinary. After 1557, the rate of confessions among tortured female Protestants plummeted. The women had learned to weaponize their own pain, turning the instruments of fear into platforms of resistance. Torture chambers became pulpits. Executioners became unwilling evangelists for their victims' courage. The authorities, terrified of creating new martyrs, began avoiding public torture altogether, opting for swift, hidden executions. The women had achieved what armies could not. They made torture politically dangerous. Yet nothing could prepare the executioners for what occurred in 1558, when one woman would literally destroy the device that had haunted England for decades. March 25, 1558. Margaret Clio is dragged into the tower's central chamber. Over the next 15 hours, what unfolds will end the rack's reign forever, but not in the way anyone expected. Margaret wasn't a typical prisoner. A Catholic convert who had sheltered priests in York, she was 43, older, heavier, marked by childbirth. Her captors believed she would break quickly. They were disastrously mistaken. According to tower records, written by the torturers themselves, Margaret Clio displayed an analytical calm no one had ever witnessed. The subject exhibits unusual patterns of resistance, noted Chief Executioner William Hartwell. She observes our methods instead of yielding to them. By the third hour, Margaret was critiquing the process. "Your left pulley is uneven," she told them. "You're losing leverage on the right beam." By the seventh hour, she was explaining why their psychological tactics failed. She dissected their cruelty with the precision of a scholar. Then, something almost supernatural happened. Around the 10th hour, the rack itself began to fail. Not because of age or rot, but because her endurance forced them to overstrain it. Her body, scarred, trembling, unbroken, absorbed pressures far beyond design limits. Hartwell's last written entry, his handwriting barely legible, reads, "The instrument weakens before the subject. Structural compromise imminent. Unprecedented." At 15 hours and 37 minutes, the tower's main rack, the same machine that had torn apart Ionescu, Rose Allen, and countless others, split down its central beam with a thunderous crack heard across the Thames. Margaret Clio didn't die from her wounds. She died from exhaustion, after outlasting the unbreakable. Her final words, recorded by a priest, were, "I have learned the weakness of men who mistake cruelty for power." 6 months later, Henry VII ordered the rack dismantled. The official reason: mechanical unreliability. But the truth was far more symbolic. Margaret had revealed the fatal flaw of systemic torture. It only works if victims believe their oppressors are invincible. The machine that had dominated Tudor England for decades was finally defeated, not by politics or mercy, but by one woman's refusal to break. Margaret Cleo's stand exposes something timeless about human endurance. That cruelty collapses when faced with those who refuse to surrender to it. The targeting of women's bodies wasn't confined to Tudor dungeons. It echoes across centuries, from wartime atrocities to modern systems of coercion. Her defiance reminds us of a brutal truth and a fragile hope. Systems of oppression depend not on force, but on despair. The rack was crafted to exploit women's bodies, their biology, and their silence, but it met its end at the hands of someone who understood that real strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the refusal to let pain define your worth. Which other forgotten torture devices were designed to target specific groups? And more importantly, which modern systems still rely on the same tactics of control that Margaret Cleo shattered? Share your thoughts below, and make sure you're subscribed.